Hey everyone, in this video we'll learn something really interesting and useful concept. It's evergreen concept. So whatever interview you go, like as an architect role or any from beginner level to architect level, so this question will be asked. That is, what is the difference between SQL and NoSQL, right? So as a software developer or software engineer or AI engineer, so whatever your designation might be in software side, you have to know this difference. So when you have to use SQL, when you have to use NoSQL. So SQL is nothing but structured query language. Let's say you have some data, you store the data in tables, in rows and columns. You follow some structure that is known as schema, and also it will follow some acid properties like atomicity, consistency, isolation, durability, and etc. etc. We'll discuss all these things, and I'll show you with an example what is this schema and this way. Let's say you have these five columns, right? So let's say five columns, and it has some 10 rows or something, right? So let's say in the first row, I have to I decided like only five columns has to be there. So throughout my table, I have to maintain like that. So for the first observation, it has to be five columns. For the second observation, it is five columns. For the tenth observation also, it has to be five columns. But in case no SQL, what we can do is, let's say first column, sorry, first row has five columns, and the second row can contain six columns, and the third row contains 10 columns, and the fourth row contains only two columns. So that you can vary. So earlier in that case in SQL, so let's say you have some five columns, it has to be fixed for all the 10 rows, it has to be fixed. And let's say you don't have the data, you have to make it as null, right? The empty one has, but the column has to be present in across all the things. That's a major difference between SQL and NoSQL. Okay, so that is what they're mentioning. Like it has to follow some structured, and mostly SQL is reliable and consistent, right? So that's why in banking application, in reservations and e-commerce, so Black Friday is going on. So all these sites, right? So they maintain some kind of a SQL only. So there is a NoSQL also. NoSQL means not only SQL, like it stores flex in flexible format, like as I mentioned earlier, in the first observation, so it can have five columns. In the second observation, it can go up to extend that to 10 columns, and the third observation it can extend only to one column, right? So that's the major logic, and also it will store it in key value base, and it will store the documents column based and graphs. So there is a Neo4j in graph storage, like in AWS. There is one service, right? So Neo4j. So you can store the data in a graph format, right? So like recommendation, like Facebook friends request, and whenever you see that graph, or Instagram friends recommendation. So that is nothing but it's a graph-based application, right? And also routes, like once we're at Google Maps, and so moving from one place to another place, it follow the shortest path and all those things. It'll follow some kind of a graph. So those things, in order to store those things, they use this NoSQL. The best examples are the Instagram feed and YouTube recommendation. And so these are the major key differences. One is structure, SQL is fixed, and NoSQL is flexible. You can enhance it. And in order to scale the SQL, it is vertical, right? So vertical meaning like the number of rows can increase. So that means in order to you have to increase the RAM. So that's why. So uh, the big server. So that's what they're mentioning. So NoSQL means it's a horizontal. Let's say you build one system, you have to create another system, you have to create another system, you have to create another system, or you have to take another, you have to use another system. But here, in a SQL, you can put some hard disk. You can put. I'm saying in an example. Okay, so you can put some hard drive. You can put some memory, so space. So that will enhance it. That is nothing but vertical scaling, and NoSQL is nothing but horizontal scaling. And SQL is best for complex queries and relationships. Relationships meaning like inner join, outer join, and all those things will be there, right? So for that purpose, like complex things, we have to use SQL. And NoSQL is high speed, like so Instagram things and etc. Those has to be extremely fast. So for those things, and they go for NoSQL. And also it's a horizontal scaling, right? Not vertical scaling. So you can easily get other things, and you can use that. So, and consistency SQL is super consistency, and NoSQL is eventually consistent. It's not that much high compared to SQL. Examples: MySQL, Postgres, Oracle. These are the examples of SQL databases, and MongoDB, Cassandra. All these things are the NoSQL database. When you have to use SQL, so if the data relationships are important, so you have to deal with one table to another table, so you have to get some data. It's a combination of both these things, or to do some inner joins, outer joins. At that time, you have to go for SQL. Let's say in e-commerce application, you have orders in one, customer data in another thing, products in another table. So you have to combine all these things to generate something. At that time, you have to go for SQL, right? And data structure is stable, and this is majorly used in software as a service, banking application, payroll. And when you have to use NoSQL, data changes frequently. Let's say you have some data fixed, and after the next column, it has to be increased, right? So large scale data, millions of billions of data, Instagram. So you don't know uh, why for one reel. So you might get some 10 comments, and the next reel it can go to 1,000 comments, 1 lakh comments, 1 lakh likes. So it's completely scalable, right? Dynamically scalable. You don't know when it will happen, but because in those scenarios you can go for this NoSQL. That's why. So when large scale of data, billions of records, when there is a scenario happens, at that time you have to go for NoSQL. So that's why whenever you are creating some social media application, best choice is go with NoSQL. And in terms of analogy, SQL is like well-organized library, and every book has a shelf and category. NoSQL is like a Google search, fast, flexible, and scalable. So, in a conclusion, there is no such winner or loser. So, according to your requirement, according to your application, you have to go for either SQL or NoSQL. Okay, and we'll discuss this acid properties. One of the most important interview question, right? So they'll ask you what is acid. So at the time you have to say A means atomicity, C means consistency, I means isolation, D means durability. So these are the four properties. It will differentiate SQL and NoSQL. So I'll explain with some examples. Atomicity means like all or nothing. Like either it will do complete transaction, or it can't do anything. It won't do any partial or in between things. That's the meaning of atomicity. Like as we discussed earlier in SQL, so we use this in banking applications. It's very important, right? So you can't send some partial amount. Like whenever you do some transaction, so entire amount has to be credited or debited, right? It can't be partial. Like okay, I let's say if I want to uh, take some 10,000, it has to give 10,000. It can't give 100 rupees now, after that 9,000 now, after that tomorrow it will give another 100. No, it shouldn't be like that. Whenever I do some transaction, it has to execute, yeah, it has to give. Unless and until, I mean, if I don't have any account balance, then this consistency rule come, right? So rules must be followed. So the bank balance has to be something, the bank balance can't be negative. Or let's say if I ask 10,000 rupees to withdraw, so but my bank account doesn't have uh, so, we'll think in a positive way. So we'll take some better example. Let's say if I ask for 100 crores, but my account have only 10 crores. In that case, so I won't get 100 crores, right? So because I have only 10 crores. So these examples make sense, right? So we have to think in a positive direction always. Okay. So so my point is like consistency means it has to across all the data, across all the table, it has to maintain some kind of rules. All rules has to be followed. So that's why they call it as consistency. Isolation means transaction should not interfere. Like if you're doing one transaction, it shouldn't interfere. So multiple transactions can happen, me and my friend and the other person also doing the same transaction at the same time. It has to deal with the scenarios, it has to deal with these conditions, right? So it shouldn't interfere, it shouldn't stop, right? It has to execute properly. That's why isolation. Next, durability is like data must stay safe forever. Like whenever power failure, system crashes, and software restart comes, at that time scenario also it has to be bit durable. Okay. So these are the major difference between SQL and NoSQL. There is no such thing like you have to know based on your requirements, based on your application. You have to know like when you have to use SQL, when you have to use NoSQL. I hope you learned something new. We'll see you in the next tutorial.